Hello, everyone. I'm Sabrina Florentino. I'm the Alternative Livestock Systems Extension Educator here at the University of Minnesota. I'm also with my co-host, Dr. Bradley Hines, who at the University of Minnesota has spearheaded all of our agrivoltaics research and especially focusing on grazing dairy cattle under solar panels. And so together we've brought you this agrivoltaics webinar series. We started last year with 4 different installments. And so we're happy to be here again this year, um, talking about similar topics, but with different perspectives and new expertise from a great lineup of speakers. Tonight, we are discussing cattle and kilowatts, so talking about grazing cattle under solar panels, and we are joined by some really excellent speakers. But most importantly, tonight, our speakers that we have with us are Will Harris, who is farmer and owner of White Oak Pastures, as well as Dale Caldwell, who is the executive director of the Center for Agricultural Resilience. And we also have Josh Bennett, who is the client executive at HUWA Enterprises. So you'll learn more about each of these individuals as we go, but we're really excited to have them all here to share about what cattle grazing under solar panels has and or will look like in their worlds. And to introduce Will and White Oak Pastures, as I've mentioned, which is a 6th-generation family farm in South Georgia, and they pasture-raise 10 species of livestock and produce eggs, organic vegetables, honey, and more. White Oak Pastures is, as they say, radically traditional farming. This means that they butcher their meat from their animals on the same location that they're raised in a regenerative manner using humane animal management practices. And this is a vertically integrated system with zero waste model, employing 155 people in their small town of Bluffton, Georgia. White Oak Pastures system effectively captures soil carbon, offsetting the majority of the emissions related to beef production, and that is data that you can find in a life cycle assessment, peer-reviewed publication, if you want to look that up. But Will Harris, who, as we've mentioned, is the farmer and owner of White Oak Pastures, is a 4th-generation cattleman, and he tends the same land that his great-grandfather settled in 1886. He was born and raised on White Oak Pastures. Later, Will attended University of Georgia School of Agriculture, where he was trained in industrial farming methods that were very common after World War II. Graduating in 1976, he returned to Bluffton, where he and his father continued to raise cattle using those pesticides, herbicides, hormones, and antibiotics. And eventually, Will understood that these tools led to externalities and excesses with these industrial methods, and so creating a monoculture of cattle. And Will notes that nature abhors a monoculture, and so he made the decision to return to farming methods of his great-grandfather from 130 years before. This has been Will's mission since then and has been recognized all over the world. He's a leader in humane animal husbandry and environmental sustainability. He's the past board of directors for Georgia Organics, and he is the beef director of the American Grass-Fed Association. He lives in his family home on the property with Yvonne and his 3 daughters. His favorite place in the world is to be out in the pastures, and I think most of us in this space could agree. So with that journey into regenerative agriculture, Will has created the Center for Agricultural Resilience, and this center was built to educate leaders around these same methods of farming on environmental, economic, and social benefits of farming, building resilient animal, plant, and human ecosystems that nourish communities. So they have been hosting workshops, and you'll hear a little bit more about that towards the end of their presentation. But this education objective is headed by Dale Caldwell, who is also joining us here today, and he is the executive director of the Center for Agricultural Resilience, where he leads the organization's strategy, partnerships, and operations to support regenerative agriculture education, as well as rural workforce development. Dale has more than 15 years of experience across government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and higher education, and his background includes watershed protection, environmental policy, Clean Water Act enforcement, and nonprofit leadership. Before CFAR, or Center for Agriculture Resilience, Dale was the regional director of the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper and taught environmental studies at the University of North Georgia. So, thank you for listening to the wealth of expertise and background that these presenters have. But all of this comes together in this evening because they have decided to graze livestock under solar panels as well. So we're here to listen to a little bit on the background of that journey and what that has looked like so far, and then their plans for grazing cattle under solar panels in the future. So Will and Dale, please take it from here.
Dale, you want me to lead out?
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Okay, so White Oak Pastures is our family farm in Bluffton, Georgia. Started by my great-grandfather and followed by my grandfather, my dad, me, and now I got a couple of adult daughters that are running the farm or helping to run the farm. On my dad's watch, my dad took over the farm post-World War II, 1945, 46. And he made the farm a monocultural cattle operation. Previous generations had cows, hogs, sheep, goats, a lot of different species, raised them on the farm, slaughtered them on the farm, sold the meat locally. But Dad really changed things. He really industrialized it. He commoditized it. Again, a monoculture, only cattle. And I'm glad he did. I think that probably the previous model would not have been successful going into the post-World War II era. But Dad was successful. He was a good cowman. I was raised on the farm, helping my dad on a monocultural cattle farm, and never wanted to do anything except raise cattle industrially, just like my dad. I loved it. We did go to the University of Georgia, majored in animal science. Graduated in 1976. I came home and ran cattle very industrially with my dad. Later took over from my dad. And we were fortunate. We had no debt and had a nice farm. And I made money every year. I went back and looked. I never made a lot of money, to be sure. But I paid taxes every year. I never lost money. Some years it wasn't much, but I never lost money. In the mid-90s, I became increasingly dissatisfied with what I was doing, not so much from a profit perspective, but from didn't like what was happening with my land and my animals and my community. I started changing things slowly, gradually. Well, not so slowly, but just kind of one thing at the time, but in pretty rapid succession. And today it's very, very different. Today we raise cows, hogs, sheep, goats, rabbits, 5 species of poultry, organic vegetables, eggs. We got about 170, I think, employees now. And we vertically integrated the farm. We built USDA inspected poultry plant, red meat plant. We try to operate at zero waste. We take the 10 tons of packing plant waste a day that we generate, we compost it, and we spread it back out on the land. And the combination of that management style, using organic model on this farm to go from 0.5% to 5.5%. And that took 20-something years to do rapid. But that's what we did. That's what we do. About 4 or 5 years ago, I learned that a friend and neighbor of mine was selling their large family farm. It was the largest land farm in Early County. That's where I live. And it was being sold to a solar voltaic company. And I really hated to hear that. I did not like the way I'd seen other farms be chopped up into solar arrays and didn't like it much. We petitioned the executive management to come down and visit with us, and they did. The CEO, nice guy named Raymond Farr, came down, and we ultimately agreed to take on the vegetation management on that 1,200 acre array, using sheep to control, for the most part, to control the vegetation. We do mow most acres once a year to get rid of the weeds that the sheep don't want to eat. But it's been very successful for us. It's been profitable. We really enjoy it. Since then, we've taken on another array, which is about 1,000 acres, and we are awaiting release of another that's a little over 1,000 acres. So we're a little over 2,000 acres now, be a little over 3,000 acres of solar arrays. And the home farm here, which has very little solar on it today, is about 3,200 acres. We have just signed a contract to build an array to power our slaughter plant, red meat slaughter plant, and poultry slaughter plant. And that's going to be about $3 million investment, and we're making that. We've arranged financing, and that's going to be our array. And we're going to have it 8 feet high so cattle can graze under it. Currently, all our grazing experience has been with sheep, and we've run some poultry under the array, under the Silicon Ranch arrays. This is going to be a cattle tracker array. So I look forward to answering your questions. I'll get off now, let Dale tell more about what he does.
Yeah, happy to. So, yeah, like Sabrina said, Will founded the organization in 2021, and we host about a dozen workshops a year here at White Oak Pastures. A few of those workshops focus on regenerative agriculture, raising multi-species livestock in a regenerative manner. And we also have a solar grazing workshop. So for the solar grazing workshop, which is ASGA certified, we spend 2.5 days covering just industry overview, contract foundations and risk sharing, vegetation management, site evaluation, logistics, infrastructure, equipment essentials, animal health and welfare, and financial considerations and scaling. We visit the 2 solar arrays that Will just spoke of. We go and spend half a day on each one of those arrays as part of the workshop too. So we have one coming up in May and then another in September. And so Sabrina's going to share some slides later on that highlight those dates as well as our website. So we invite you to come to our website, thecfar.org, and I'll type it in the chat as well. Visit our website to learn more information about how to register for one of these workshops. And I too am happy to answer any questions you have about the workshops. And we're excited about the opportunity for Will to embark on this cattle tracker and be able to have that as part of the learning experience.
Thank you, Will and Dale, for sharing a little bit more of your background and beginning with agrivoltaics and where that's heading. Could you just describe a little bit more you mentioned cattle tracker, and you mentioned they'll be 8 feet high, but what else did you consider in I don't know how far you're in the planning, but in putting cattle under panels, what else have you been considering, and what have you learned with sheep so far?
The cattle panels are about 8 feet high at the lowest point, and they're fixed. They don't oscillate with the sun. We graze the sun around with the track with the sun. The ones we're putting up will not do that. we've got plenty of space here, so that wasn't necessary. Felt like it might make the panels a little more rigid, a little more rugged. Uh, the we're going to build the array near the slaughter plants because that's where we're going to use the electricity. We're going to bring a number of pastures together in a wagon wheel type scenario, and because we rotate throughout the pastures, we only graze one paddock one day, and then it'll be 60 or 70 days before we move back to it to give the grass time to recover. So, but where the panels actually sit will be in the hub of one of those grazing pivots where they go around, and it'll be and so they'll be. And that's because we need shade in that, and they'll provide the shade for the cows. The power bill at our slaughter facility is about $26,000 to $27,000 a month, 12 months a year, and we feel like the size array we're putting in will just about cover that. Not quite, but just about. We've elected to stay hooked up to the grid. We're not going to depend entirely on our solar panels. So at night we'll buy electricity. Later on, we will add batteries. It's been advised not to buy batteries now because they're technologically improving them dramatically at a very rapid rate.
Will, could you expand on your experiences with sheep under panels? What you liked or didn't like about that? And obviously, you produce cattle, so that was a natural fit to design this next set for cattle. But could you just make that connection there between your experiences with grazing sheep under panels?
We felt like we were taking a big risk when we signed the contract to manage that vegetation for 5 years, which is what we did, because we didn't have time, and we're not interested in mowing that over 1,000 acres every 6 8 more times per year. But it's worked beautifully. We've had so little problems. We had just a very few wires that the sheep damaged because they were too low. Very few. Almost no mortality from the sheep from electrocution. Not just normal mortality down there. It's just worked out better than expected. We were paid to maintain that vegetation. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't talk about the rate, but I think it's fair. And we've got a pretty good accounting department at White Oak Pastures, and they pull a separate operating statement for that operation, and it's profitable for us. It's not a get rich deal. Nothing I do is a get rich deal, but it is profitable. We do enjoy it, and again, we moved from that 1,000-acre array to another 1,000-acre array, and we're about to take on another over 1,000-acre array. I don't think I want much more. I think we have a slaughter plant, as I mentioned, and we don't sell live animals. We sell meat, and I don't know how much lamb I can sell. I think this may be all I want. But I'm an advocate for solar grazing. I do think that it's the right thing to do. I think that a mistake was made with the decision to make these arrays so low. They were being designed not by stockmen, but by engineers who were trying to come up with the cheapest structure they could come up with that would be rugged and capture the sun's energy. Raising the panels up another 5 or 6 feet is quite expensive, but I think it'll save them. I'm convinced, and I think I've convinced some of them that it'll save them money in the long run. The fact is, I'm a better cattleman than I am sheep farmer, and the per capita consumption of beef in this country is nearly 50 per year. The per capita consumption of land, I hadn't looked lately, but I don't think it's about a pound per person per year. So the market for beef is much better. There's a lot more cattle. I guess it depends on where you are in the country. South, we've got between 2,000 and 3,000 head of sheep, and that's about as many as anybody I know in the deep South, in Texas and beyond. There's some bigger flocks.
Yeah, thank you for that description of going from sheep to cattle and what you've seen so far with those experiences. We do have some questions in the chat getting into sort of the land use side, but one of the more simpler ones is, how did you get the solar company to agree to agrivoltaics under the panels?
Yeah, there was a little pushback on that deal. But the name of the company that I graze for is Silicon Ranch. And one of the things I told them is it'll make honest men out of you. You're Silicon Ranch. You don't have a ranch. You've got a solar farm. But they did see the ecological value. I mentioned in my introduction that the organic model on our farm here has gone from 0.5% to 5.5%. And we're very proud of that. I think that's one of our greatest accomplishments here. And I don't think that'll happen if you're mowing the crop. I think if you're grazing the crop and manure and urine and go back down, building the microbial activity in that soil, I think that's when you get the carbon at an elevated level. And by the way, I realize I'm talking to people in Minnesota and other places in the country, and 5.5% may not be real high for organic matter where you live, but in the coastal plains of the deep South, it's pretty good.
Could you expand on that piece just a little bit more, knowing we have people from all walks of life, of the importance of that ecological impact and the management of the livestock to accomplish that? What does that look like?
So what I'm told and what I believe is that 1% organic matter will absorb generally a 1-inch rainfall. So if you have a 0.5% organic matter, as I had, anything over a 1/2 inch rain is not going to do you much good. It'd be a lot of runoff. Now that we have 5.5% organic matter, we can absorb a 5.5 inch rain, and not if it comes in 30 minutes, but if it comes over a period of days. And if you look at my website, whiteoakpastures.com, somewhere in there's a video of a waterway where the rainwater is coming off my farm and my neighbor's farm, which is a industrially farm, row crop farm, and it looks like X-fold. I don't know how many, two or three, 4 times as much water's coming off his farm as mine, because mine's being soaked up. And the water coming off his side is just muddy as chocolate milk. And off my side looks like tea. So from a land perspective, there's just no doubt in my mind that this is way, way better. And I think that's why the solar company that I work with, Silicon Ranch, chose to take this risk, make this plunge. And it was a risk, because when we started doing it, very few, if anybody, was doing it in this country. Very few. I went to visit one. I got permission to go see one solar array in California, and they were using sheep but I don't think they got but 3 or 4 inches of rain a year, so they weren't growing much grass under there anyway.
So similar to convincing others of the importance of agrivoltaics, one of the questions is there's significant resistance in parts of, many parts of the country for large solar farms, and a major part of that argument is taking that productive farmland away and our people are interested in prioritizing farmland preservation. Have you, Will or Dale, had to deal with local or state governing bodies who are resistant to allowing those types of projects, agrivoltaic projects, to be built? And then any thoughts you might have on how to convince local communities and residents, as well as ag landowners who don't see these types of projects or don't want to see these projects built across the landscape?
I am aware of that from local companies that don't want solar arrays. And I've actually been asked by Silicon Ranch to go and visit with some people a couple hundred miles from here that were protesting a big project that they were going to do. And those people were mad, and I understood, but I was really surprised at how angry they were. Uh, and I think the mistake was made in the way that in the early presentation. You know, I live in one of the poorest counties in the United States, and a venture that's going to generate some revenue is generally welcome here. Now we want to know about the downside. We want to know about that. But and I'll say this: I don't think that solar arrays are beautiful to look at. I mean, I just as soon not have on 3 sides of my house. But it's you got to be able to afford whatever beauty you want, and I don't think that they are unattractive. I think they're just not real natural looking. So, when I talked to those people and told them that I did think that it changes the aesthetics, and it doesn't necessarily change them for the better. I don't think it's awful. And I don't think that 100% of your county should go into solar arrays. But having some around to generate power, if it improved the quality of life, the standards, economic standards of the people that were maintaining it, there's a place for that.
We just have one more question before we transition over to Josh, and all of you in the audience keep those questions coming, and we'll get to more at the end. But the question is circling back to the question everyone has: is raising those panels 8 feet off the ground, the costs of that, the economics of that. And I know, Will, you did mention that you think it's beneficial in the long run. Could you tie that back into the economics and what you meant by that?
Yeah, it did add significant expense to the project, and I do not know exactly how much. I didn't get it priced both ways, so I don't know that. It does add significantly to the expense. There's no doubt it's worth it to me because I need the shade so much more for cattle than I do sheep. You understand, when I raise the panels, I can still put sheep under it, but I have the option of also putting cattle under it. And I think there's some other agronomic things that we can do under those panels that I hadn't talked about yet. That's going to be high enough that I can run a low-profile tractor under it. And we're excited about experimenting to find out what is highest and best use. The fertility under those panels is going to be incredible because, as I said, they're going to graze a larger area and go into those panels for shade. And I've seen what that does. It concentrates the manure. You can't do it too much, but you can manage it. So that was going to be some really rich land for, I can think of a lot of things I'm going to try to do with it. I'm excited about it.
Thank you, Will and Dale. Any last comments before we transition to Josh? And as mentioned, we will have many more questions towards the end.
Uh, to I think it was Scott's question about advocacy or opposition. I think just getting out in front of ahead of the proposals with the outreach and education and some of the benefits, because once the proposal comes in from someone in the industry, it just seems like it's all about everyone coming to oppose, not learn. So I think there's something to be said for getting out ahead of things before the proposal is there, and that's why there's great operations like Extension, where we're at today this evening, sharing this together, ASCA, American Solar Grazing Association. So I think as an industry as a whole, it's kind of there is that component. And it's the same way with like wastewater treatment plants, and best available technologies now that didn't exist decades ago, and people not understanding that a, a treatment plant, a wastewater treatment plant in 2026 is a lot different than one from 1986. And so just a bit of ignorance there.
All right, thank you both. Lots more questions coming in the chat, but we will get to those after Josh. And if Josh wants to start pulling up his slides, and we'll get to know a little bit more about Josh as well. So, Josh Bennett is a seasoned renewable energy professional with over 18 years of experience, now driving innovative agrivoltaic and sustainable land use initiatives at HUWA Enterprises. Josh spent nearly 18 years at EDF Renewables North America, where he advanced from field operations to managing meteorological programs for wind and solar projects across the United States, Mexico, and Canada. He later led development efforts for utility-scale wind and solar in New York and gained deep insight into grid-scale renewable integration and environmental stewardship. Josh recently joined HUWA Enterprises, which is a family-owned company founded by the HUWA family with deep agricultural roots in northern Colorado. H2 blends generational farming and ranching knowledge with large-scale expertise in land reclamation, civil construction, environmental science, and renewables. As client executive, Josh leads the expansion of civil construction, land management, and renewable energy development projects with intentional agricultural focus. Drawing on H2 Enterprises' signature preclamation methodology, which applies agronomic science, soil health principles, and prospective solutions before projects begin. He advances dual benefit agrivoltaics. These integrate productive agriculture with solar infrastructure. H2 has successfully integrated cattle grazing on multiple utility-scale solar sites across varied panel configurations with minimal modifications, creating a robust value stack, improved cattle health, and enhanced farm stability and revenue, optimized energy production, and elevated site ecological health. So hopefully Josh can answer a few of those questions that are in the chat on this subject particularly. So thank you, Josh. We're excited to hear more.
Yeah. Thank you guys for inviting me. I really appreciate it. The questions are already great, and Will has already helped line up a lot of these slides that I have set for you. I also want to say it's really an honor to be on this with Will. I know your reputation in industry, and I went out to your cattle voltaic seminar with Silicon Ranch, and I still have my name tag, and I'll never let that go. So I'll get started. Just for additional background on me, I was with EDF Renewables for 17 years with a degree in child psychology, so you never know where you're going to end up. I started out there as a wind turbine mechanic, eventually managed our meteorological towers. We had about 260 throughout the US, Canada, and Mexico. I managed the installation and removal and data from those Met towers. And then after that, I started doing utility scale development in New York. And I'll try to kind of come through. You gave a good little breakdown of who HUWA is, and we're a unique beast in terms of what we do and our areas of expertise. And I think you'll see it's a bit of a unique blend, and I'll give you a little background into how I got there. I was at EDF developing utility scale solar. I became extremely frustrated in the field by two core things. One was the unwillingness and inability to meet agricultural needs in the communities where I was trying to develop projects. Proposing agrivoltaics was complicated. The hoops you'd have to jump through, even just to propose it, were overwhelming. And the bottom line is, I did not want to lie to a landowner and say we'll likely do something that we wouldn't. And we just weren't prepared to do it at that point in time. But I also know how important it is when I get frustrated when developers talk about how little land they take overall. When you take 1,500 acres out of a small agricultural community, you mess up that local economy. You create a lot of havoc. And I find the way we talk about it often to be somewhat disrespectful. The second major thing was watching civil construction take place. As someone who's passionate about soil health and even the potential for agrivoltaics, if you don't know how to do early seeding and civil construction, you're never going to get there. These animals deserve quality forage, and you're not going to have it if you compact the soil and you micrograde and you do a lot of these things. So anyway, a little bit of rambling. Main thing is HUWA Enterprises. I met them. Brent, the owner, started as HUWA Cattle. It's a 600 head Black Angus farm out of Roggen, Colorado. But they also have HUWA Farms. Right now, I don't know the exact acreage, but we have several thousand acres of row crop production. So strong familiarity with the ag space, irrigation. Eventually, they moved into the world of land reclamation. At this point, we've done reclamation on nearly 4 million acres of land in over 43 states. Eventually, of course, that transitioned into construction. Biggest focus for us is civil. We've done civil on solar projects as big as 500 megawatts. We could go bigger if needed. And that reclamation work ties so beautifully to that civil work. And when you have that background in agriculture, like as you mentioned, we describe it as doing anything with agricultural intent. So if we're going to grow crops on a project, you want to have somebody who has a vested interest in the yield of that crop doing that type of work. Additionally, we have Terran, which is our analytical space where we have our drone team go out, fly sites, get high level data to make sure you do early stage de-risking. I'll kind of leave it at that. I was brought in to begin doing some development because I've always stated that if you engage the farming community, honestly, they'll likely want to play ball and develop energy projects. And what I've found out in less than around a year at HUWA is that it's true. We've got several 100,000 acres of landowners that want to be a part of this energy space, just don't want to give up several generations of blood, sweat, and tears to do it. And so, I try to leverage a little bit of AI here and give you a sense. And when I say here how the world sees it, a lot of times it's really how engineers see it. The idea of cattle grazing. And then here's how HUWA saw it when we went on our first site. If you notice up there in the corner of these, you've got those two shade structures. They look an awful lot like those solar ports you might see. The bottom line is shade has a huge, huge impact on cattle. And for the owners who have a cat, this made the most sense to them looking and being on these sites, seeing how much shade is out there and oftentimes decent forage. It just made perfect sense for them to use it as natural heat abatement. And when you combine that with the growing threat, bottom line is heat stress is a growing threat to the beef and dairy industry. I have another slide where I'll dive a little bit deeper into the numbers there. And that's only getting worse with rising temperatures. What happens under heat stress? Core body temperature of that cow increases, reduces their feed intake, rumen function drops, their immune system is compromised, leading to disease, leading to mortality, leading to reproductive failure. So it just creates a cascading list of different problems. Here's a little bit of, some statistics around that through peer-reviewed research. It increases feed intake by 6%. The value shade can bring into that space. You can get a rate of gain on those cattle up to 7% better. You have feed intake improves. You have your conception rate dropping when you don't have that stress. It reduces mortality risk. I don't want to be redundant here or repeat myself, but it's a lot of that same information. And, it can improve your lactation rate, which again, I think the core thing here is looking at a financial impact. Heat can either be shade can be a huge positive financial impact on a farm and on a ranch, whereas heat stress can be a huge it is a huge multi-billion-dollar negative impact on the beef and dairy industry annually. I don't know if I need to go into, I have a lot of slides. I try really hard to have, if people want more information, details, I'm happy to share it. But I really want to get to some of the footage because I think people will like it. Because that is, I think, is really what we're trying to focus on here. Give me 1 second. I've got too many things on my screen. Apologies. I think one thing to set the stage is to really understand, and I know Will already talked a little bit about how much beef U.S. consumes. But there's two core things. It's just the scale of the industry that is massive, and also the amount of land being used to either graze or feed cattle, which is around 805 million. You've got a $112 billion market for cattle and calves in the U.S. It's the number one ag commodity. Dairy receipts over 50 billion, and on the global stage, 71 billion, and it is the largest driver of U.S. feed grain demand. So the bottom line here is that the industry is massive and has a huge impact in many of these rural communities. So I kind of wanted to do that in order to set the stage for how we did our pilot site. And I'm realizing I feel like one of my slides here is missing, but that's okay. I have too many and I remember what was on. When we were going into this, we really wanted to start identifying what are the big risks? What are people most concerned with? And the bottom line is it comes down to, is it going to hurt our cattle? Is it going to cost too much? Well, there's a lot of factors that are consistently brought up. I'll see if I can grab that slide so I can be a little clearer on that. But the main thing is what we want to address is, can we successfully graze cattle under solar without having to make massive modifications? Because in a competitive environment for solar, changes to site that you often need in order to kind of consider cattle grazing or agrivoltaics in general can make projects non-competitive. Because if I'm competing against another project, and it's basically going to be all around price, you get all these at times adders for doing agrivoltaics that you can get some benefit, but at the end of the day, it almost always comes down to price. And if I have to pay more for the same project, how am I going to compete against that project? And that's part of the huge challenge for us to really advance it. And so we really wanted to prove out, based on our experience, both in solar and within the ag space, that we can do this without having to do anything too crazy. So in our pilot site, we had 3 sites in Louisiana. Each one was at a minimum of 750 acres, 3 different torque tube heights. We had 5, 5.5, and 7 foot, all rotational trackers. The 7 foot torque tube height is a 2-piece system. You can see it in future photos. It's 2 panels pieced together as opposed to 1 on the rotational tracker. We had Black Angus, Red Angus, Charolais, and mixed breeds on site. They were all yearlings. We procured from a local farm, excuse the typo there. And they brought them in around 700 to 750 pounds. And we did a 6-month rotational grazing program. In order to set up the site, we basically did electrical fencing, hot wire testing. We removed all of the behavioral issues. Prior to getting them out on site, what you often find is that you have a whole group of cattle and there's a lot of interactions with the system, but it tends to be 1 or 2. By really getting them out of the system, you improve your chances of having a successful run here right away. We also had strategic water placement from a local well on each of these sites and had about a stocking rate of 1.5 head per acre. And what we did is we hardened the site. How do we protect the site from the cattle? It was really a few things. We tidied up the cabling, which helps reduce your fire risk anyway. We protected the inverter and combiner boxes with fencing. And essentially that was it. And then we used the wire fencing to set up our paddocks. And just additional context, what are we talking about in terms of cattle size? For the Angus, we're looking at 6 months calves, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, 550 to 700 pounds. Where we brought them in was at that 3.5 to 4.5 foot tall and 700 to 1,200 pounds. So like I said, we brought them in at around 700 pounds. And so, here's what we get. Hopefully there's no volume because it's loud. And the main thing is no major design changes. Nope. I hope you can't hear that, but I'll mute it just in case. So there were no modules damaged on any sites. They were incredible mowers. They got areas that sheep wouldn't get. They got, not areas necessarily, but they got grasses that the sheep wouldn't eat. We had 0 energy losses. A lot of folks thought you would have to table the modules in order to keep the cattle away. We didn't do it, and we had no issues. There was no impact on insurance, and we actually ended up lowering insurance costs, and I can explain why. It improved, as Will was talking about. Rotational grazing is known to improve site ecology, and we fundamentally saw quality, the following following this grazing effort, we did hear and see um, that the project was positively impacted. And the one thing people hadn't really thought about, but I think is really critical, is it provides O&M support. Oftentimes on these massive projects, you may not have O&M, your operations and maintenance crew, go out into areas of this project at all for long stretches of time. And by having this grazing program, if our guy heard something in the northwest corner of the project, we have a process to mark it down, get in touch with O&M so they can get out there and find these problems when they're small and before they become big. And that was a huge advantage. Today, sorry if there's errors on this slide. I was stressing to try to get this out to you. My friend Matthias at NextTracker has really helped reinforce a lot of what we've been talking about and kind of quelling a lot of the fears around this. They did a more worst case scenario where out in Brazil, they had a 2 megawatt site. They didn't use all the acreage, but it was a torque tube height of 5 feet. They had bulls. They had jerseys, crossbreeds. They had several varieties, 20 on the site. And I'll share the footage with you. NextPower used to be NextTracker, and they're a global tech firm that does a lot of these racking systems as well as the technology in order to have them rotate with the sun. And I was really happy he was willing to share this because, as you'll see here, similarly, this is what we saw on site. When I talked to all of our grazers, this is exactly the behavior we saw consistently. As you know, the bigger challenge is when you move the cattle, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that. I just want to give a chance. I don't know how long this is. I don't think it's too long. There. All right. There is a moment that I think is really impressive when the tracker actually does start to rotate. And I think you want to keep a close eye on how the cattle behave. In fact, I will speak to you a little bit about while watching this. There it is. It just got touched. That was the craziness. 2 things I want to bring up. The bottom line is everyone's fearful that the cattle are going to damage modules. Bottom line is modules get damaged anyway, through traditional mowing, through rocks getting picked up from people managing the mowers and hitting them. Modules get damaged. We fundamentally believe that you'll likely see less module damage through a rotational grazing system than you would through a lot of traditional mowing. And the main thing that our grazers on site talk about is there's value in not just understand. You can have a great grazer who really knows the rotational program. However, if they don't have any training in solar, they may make decisions that don't make a ton of sense. And it's only because they don't have that experience. So the biggest issues you have are when you have to move the cattle and get them to water. And if you are someone who understands solar and the grazing piece, you avoid moving those cattle when the modules are at their lowest tilt. It's that simple type of thing that really makes a huge difference in terms of how you manage the system and you keep it protected. And again, why is it worth it? The bottom line from my perspective is you have 2 worlds that are converging and struggling. You have increasing farm instability. You have also with the solar side and in general, an increasing energy demand, but more and more opposition to these projects. You're seeing moratoriums, you're seeing increased regulatory hurdles, loss of tax incentives. And then the farming side, obviously you have instability with global exports, you have feed costs variability, you have extreme heat events that are happening more often. Average age of a farmer is getting, it's over 58, I believe, at this point. Many of them having to take on second jobs, which increases mental health risks. So the bottom line, you have these 2 forces that are merging together. And what I see here is that there's actually a convergent solution when you tie them together. On the farm stability side, what you get for, if you're leasing your land, you get a very stable, regular income from the solar lease. And when I say that, a solar lease is not going to be subject to blight or drought or disease. It is going to be there and allow you to make investments back into your farm. You're likely going to have lower feed costs and a higher rate of gain, lower water costs, lower risk to mortality or morbidity or disease, as we discussed earlier. And on the solar side, you get an increase in community support. You get a lower development timeline because typically you're going to have one landowner as opposed to having several. You're likely going to have a more accepting community, which will help you through that permitting. You don't have to spend nearly as much money on community opposition. You also improve the site ecology. And I know we talked about it earlier. Will had talked about it, but all of the organic matter that's being created through a good rotational grazing program, not only does it lead to better soil, but deeper root systems. And what does that improve from a solar side? Stormwater risk. Stormwater risk is a massive issue within the industry. And by having a quality rotational grazing program and improving the site ecology, you are de-risking your site. And when I talked earlier about how we actually were able to lower insurance costs, that was one of the core things, because our underwriters understand the agricultural piece, the soil piece, and the solar piece. We went to the solar underwriters, and it really they speak the same language. It eased up the conversation, and we were really able to convince them that this is actually better for the site. Adding in the tightening of the cables, reducing fire risk, and then having that O&M support was kind of backed it up. And the big thing here is for a solar developer, it just opens up, as we discussed earlier, millions of acres of opportunity. And then even beyond the developers and the solar companies and the farmer, we've already talked about it, the nutrient cycling, what that does to land and soil and site ecology. But for the community, again, these projects bring true, meaningful, stable revenue, not subject to market fluctuation. That community can then reinvest back into the things that are most important to it. And oftentimes that is its ag space. And again, you're helping to build projects that align with community values. Some of the core things I see needed in order to scale this, policy and research, agri-PV needs to begin to be recognized on state level. I think one of the big challenges we have with agri-PV is a legitimacy issue. And this is why I see cattle voltaics being so important. And I worry that people think that I'm talking negatively about sheep, and I am not. I love our sheep farmers. I think any acre grazed with sheep is better than most likely a traditional mower. However, within the ag space, I don't think they see sheep grazing as legitimate. Whereas if we are able to move cattle into that space because of just the size of that industry, we begin to build legitimacy from the ag side. And then all of a sudden you have a much more powerful lobby, a much more powerful force trying to create change and increase the volume of agrivoltaics. And I see that as one of the biggest things that we have to work on. When it comes to policy and research, the competitive RFP incentives is a big one, and I alluded to that earlier. If you have a vendor doing an RFP where everyone's competing on a semi-equal level and you want to do agri-PV, how are you going to compete in terms of pricing? I think there's a lot of creative things that can be done, including immediate priority to a project that does have agri-PV, as long as they come in at a similar or within 10% of the price that's expected. There's a lot of creative ways you can do that. And I think that'll drive innovation. Rather than just throwing tons and tons of money at it, force people to innovate, because they get the competitive advantage. More investment into research. There is still risk. We need to make sure that we can get lender and investor alignment, get them understanding the ag side, bankable agri-PV project models, insurance frameworks. And again, long story short, we need a lot of partnerships and contracts. We need long-term grazing contracts for folks like Will who are doing this. It can't be a year or two. That it's hard to build a financial model into that. We need to see increases in standards and training. One thing we're trying to work on at HUWA is an agri-PV internship where we focus on the solar piece as well as the animal welfare piece. See. Now, just to give you a little context, this was the moment Brent realized he wanted to graze cattle. 7-foot, 2-piece system, 32-foot, pile-to-pile spacing, 17 feet in between rows. And he's just looking at this saying, why don't we have cattle? This doesn't make any sense. And this is at our home site in Roggen, Colorado, where Brent installed, it's kind of makeshift and brought out some bulls just to use for various events we do on site. And it's been a big success. And this is a photo I took literally yesterday because I was out in New Mexico working on a farm. And again, it's just that giant shade structure, to me, could easily be bringing additional revenue to that farm. I think that's the conclusion of my presentation, but I also want to say, and I know it was alluded to earlier, a big part of this, and it's something I talk about a lot in presentations, is, when we go, like at EDF, if we were to go into a Native American community, we would hire subject matter experts that truly understand the language, the culture, the economy. Yet we don't seem to apply that same rule when it comes to small agricultural communities. And that is something that has always baffled me. I see a number of developers go into a community that's 90%, 98% of their economy is driven through beef and dairy. And then they come in and all excited to say, hey, but we're going to have 3,000 sheep. It doesn't mean that that's a bad thing, but it identifies you don't understand that community and what's of value to them. And we need to see improvements in how we approach those communities. I'll leave it at that. I have so many notes based on previous questions, and I'm happy to answer more. And so I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Josh. Really great presentation full of many details and all the different aspects that are to be considered in these spaces, from the livestock to the solar developer to the soil health. But we do have some really great discussions in the chat, a lot on the trade-offs of these types of systems. But before we get into those complexities, one of the first questions was, what sort of ground disturbance is there with these solar sites, maybe from any of your perspectives, Will, Dale, or Josh? And maybe Josh, you can speak to sort of the preclamation strategy as well that you've mentioned.
There's
Make sure I'm not. Oh, go ahead, Will.
There's a tremendous amount of soil disturbance in the construction process, and it's unfortunate, and it doesn't make you very happy. What we have learned is that if we will establish a really rugged, perennial, deep-rooted species of turf before the construction starts, the land handles the construction much better. I've been really, we planted Bahia grass or Bermuda grass, which are warm season perennial, deep rooted. For the southeast, they're deep rooted. Then we've seen far less erosion and other damage from the construction process.
Yeah, Will is spot on from our experience. It's a challenge to get pre-seeding and early seeding done on a lot of these sites because there's communication gaps. It's oftentimes going to be tied to who your EPC is and who they choose as their sub and who they choose to do the seeding. Do they have the right machinery to get the seeds deep enough or shallow enough? Do they have the right? Are they using straw mulch or something to can really keep the seed stuck to the ground in drier, sandier soils? It's a complicated science that requires agronomy. And a lot of your EPCs and or IPPs don't have agronomists on staff or vegetation managers on staff that understand the nuances of how you need to treat that soil. And we've gone through such a long stretch of just micrograding and grading and not having the right machinery on site. So it's about early understanding of soil conditions, about the right seed, as Will mentioned, making sure you get something with deep root systems established in order to deal with those compaction issues. But it's also, that's when Brent makes up words all the time at the company, and he refers to it as preclamation. Sometimes to get soil stabilized and get seeds established, you need to do some light earthwork in order to make that happen. And it's really about understanding that process and taking it seriously.
Brad, did you have anything you wanted to add into site disturbance, what that has looked like in Morris?
We really haven't had much disturbances. We provide more grass around the solar panels so they can graze. So they're not standing underneath the solar panels 24 hours a day. When you do that, we don't have any issues. Is there some? Yes, they stand under it when it gets really hot, but really not a lot of disturbances underneath the solar panels. They don't, the grass maintains under the panels, no problem.
And as far
we were
as
speaking a bit more to construction disturbance.
Construction disturbances? No, we haven't had any. We haven't had any because we don't allow big equipment to go in there and do it. You have to go in and hammer the poles in, and we haven't had any disturbance. Zero.
But speaking to the cattle side of disturbance, there's strategic, so the reality is we don't design projects logically for this type of work. You need better spacing between your outer fencing and your panel array. You need there's a lot of things that need to be done differently. However, when it comes to water, I think there's strategic ways to move it out of grassed areas where you're going to have them start to gather, move it into areas that have more gravel, because no matter what, when you move them, they're going to gather. And it's also, yeah, timing matters, and there's other factors. There's ways to mitigate against that.
So going back to Brad's comments about the disturbance via cattle, and just to provide some background details, so in Morris, the solar arrays were installed into already established perennial pastures, and they don't take up the entire pasture, as he mentioned. So cattle are rotated on and off those arrays as needed. Within the more traditional setups, maybe that Will has seen with his sheep and Josh with the yearlings that you've grazed, there's some discussion about when we put panels on top of growing vegetation, what are those impacts? So does the vegetation species change? Do you see changes in ground cover because of shade, or changes in moisture, either greater or less because they're preventing rain and or increasing the soil moisture through that microclimate? Just some of your observations, what those trade-offs have been to put panels over vegetation, and what the impacts have been for having grazing livestock then in that vegetation, for Will or Josh.
We have found that it's far, far better to establish the turf before the construction starts. So many of the arrays that we have grazed have got the tram lines so that you can't go all the way through with the equipment. Establishing after construction is just very, very difficult. Getting a good turf ahead of the construction is, I think, essential, and I think we've convinced our solar developer that that's the way they want to do it too. It's cheaper. We can get out there with a 20-foot grain drill and put it in like we want to, as opposed to the working around that existing infrastructure of the array.
Yeah, spot on. It's the early planning, getting those deep root systems established well before construction is critical. Additionally, when it comes to the microclimate under the array is a real thing. We've seen a number of different studies looking at that, seeing efforts to improve grassland rehabilitation in more of your dry land environments is successful through some pilots. So I think there's a lot of ways for us to leverage that, but even at that, like, it is then almost more sensitive that you get established grasses in those dryland environments where you don't have as deep or as much organic matter in the soil. It becomes even more critical. So it's just a piece of the industry that unfortunately has not received the level of focus that it needs to, given the impacts that it has. And again, if we can double down on carbon sequestration if we do this right. We can absolutely, like I said, we can double down on it when doing it right, and that's by getting the grazing moved in with it. It's just to me the most logical way. Yep.
And with that, any observations on differences in vegetation cover under panels versus inter-row, whether that's different species or vegetation cover itself? What has that looked like for your experiences?
I'm in the deep south. We get 52 inches of rain a year, a lot of humidity in the air. We do note that the drip line of the panels, as they oscillate back and forth, has more moisture than directly under the panel. You can see the ground's wet. As far as the growing of the vegetation, I hadn't seen too much difference. Those aggressive perennial, warm season perennial root systems reach out, and I've really not seen drought stress in rows under the panels, but I have seen uneven distribution of the moisture. You would think it would lead to drought stress, but I've not seen that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we'll strategically want more native grasses under the modules to serve as somewhat of a natural windbreak in those more sandy soils. So there's sometimes strategic reasons to do that. It's a very difficult question to answer. I'm not really the core soil scientist, but I'll say that there's so many factors that matter to, it's about who did the seeding, did they have the right equipment, did they post construction do any reclamation to ensure that the vegetation remained established and continued to grow? There's so many different factors that play a part of it. And then it's also about, is it being mowed? Is it being grazed? Is it, I apologize to try to back out of it, but it can be quite challenging to answer that one cleanly.
With any experiences or I don't know, Brad, if you know any research looking at the different spacings between row and advantages or disadvantages as far as grazing.
I don't know any differences between or any research on row spacing between panels. Um, yeah, we made ours a little bit wider because we wanted to be able to drive a tractor through it without wrecking the solar panels. So that's why ours are probably a little bit wider than maybe the normal uh, solar panel installation. But I haven't seen any research on that.
I think when we start looking at these projects more as, because right now the income from these projects is driven through the solar piece. Solar developers were really hired to create, electrons and develop and gather energy at the lowest cost possible, not really to farm. So they weren't intentionally designed for the integration of agriculture. As we start to see improvements and we start to understand the value of that shade, if we could put a financial value on it, we can start seeing more logical blended economic efforts to start accommodating more of that larger row spacing, which is honestly going to make more viable agriculture long term. Um, of course, if we are grazing cattle, we've done it in very like narrow rows. It works. We can make it work. But in an ideal world, we would much rather have 20-foot row spacing, something where we can do a combination of grazing, haying, something where we can get more diversified agricultural production. But again, this comes back to the idea of how does a company begin to make this project financially viable in a market that it's about price. And that's where I say once we begin to look at the project more as a real true agrivoltaic system, as opposed to just trying to farm under existing system, but we're designing it intentionally for agricultural production, we can start adjusting lease rates tied to ease of farming. We need to be more creative, but it requires that collaborative effort that we're not seeing enough of, but I do see a lot of increased efforts to start making it work.
All right, circling back to maybe more the logistics for cattle. One question is, do the cattle have to be in a rotation pasture setup in these types of systems? And maybe um, could you speak to what that looks like to be able to rotate them? I'll stop there. That's the first question.
I don't know why you would not want to rotate the cattle through. I mean, it's within our grazing that's not on the panels. The benefits of rotational grazing are unquestionable. Be harder than it is. Cattle need to be rotated. The grass needs to be eaten off and have a long time to recover.
Yeah, I mean, for us, the purpose oftentimes is to try to gain long-term reductions in vegetation management costs. That's where the rotational piece is very valuable to us. It's also valuable to the cattle and to the site. I'm trying to think of those scenarios where I wouldn't be looking to rotate if that's on a feedlot or something along those lines. It's an entirely different system and different strategy you might take, or in a lot of dryland environments where you don't have anywhere near the stocking rate that you would have in an area like Louisiana where you get 30 inches of rain. Then maybe you're talking about trying to do some elevated modules or something else in order to allow larger cattle to roam more freely. But for us right now, our core focus is on the rotational grazing, without a doubt.
All right, then does anyone know if there's been focus on smaller cattle breeds and trying to utilize them with solar grazing? And then also just tying into that, thinking of cattle health, any issues with stray voltage? I know, Will, you mentioned you haven't had any deaths with your sheep due to electrocution, but any thoughts on those two fronts?
I don't know. I don't personally. I would not see the need to have smaller cattle. I mean, our cattle are pretty moderate in frame score. I went through the period of time in the '70s when I wanted them to be as tall as I could get them. I outgrew that, and now I like a moderate frame score. Not because of the panels, because that's what I find works best for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The first time I hadn't been with HUWA, I was with EDF, and I was with all my cattle landowners out in New York. And I said, "Hey, I'm going to do a little summit. I want to talk about potential of cattle grazing." And of course, I do this presentation. First thing I say is miniature cattle or low line cattle, and they laughed at me. Thankfully, I had some goodwill built up with those folks, and they didn't kick me out the door. I think anytime it makes sense, go for it. Absolutely. If low line cattle is a system that works for you and it exists with your already existing agricultural practice, go for it. I think those things may end up being a bit more niche, and because you have more issues with the processing facilities, and they create more challenges. And my feeling is I would like to see us really push to meet existing agricultural systems. Obviously, we're not going to get massive multi-million dollar combines out into these fields at this point in time. But in terms of the cattle piece, I don't think we need to go to low line or to lower smaller cattle to make it work. But I will repeat, if that is what you already are doing, or if that's the system that makes economic sense to you and you have the processing facilities ready to do it, it's going to be easier for a lot of the solar companies probably to buy into it at first. But I think the core here is really let's try to meet these markets where they're at, as opposed to try to change it.
All right, tying into that, as you already alluded to, Josh, what are all of your thoughts on different settings? Would this work in a feedlot setting? What is dust and other issues that might occur in those types of settings? Or on the contrary, or another idea was putting solar panels under a irrigation pivot. What are your thoughts in those scenarios?
Was that one for me?
Anyone?
When it comes to the irrigating, so we've done irrigation systems already within solar arrays. Things you got to be very sensitive to is the salination and the quality, water quality. You need to ensure that it's not something that's going to end up damaging or reducing the life of those modules. It's really critical. So we like to leverage pivots and these things for getting that seed established when we prior to construction, but also more linear irrigation systems. There's a lot of different and creative ways you can do it. When it comes to feedlots, yeah, I definitely do believe that that is a great opportunity. We have not done any projects on feedlots. What we have looked at is a feedlot looking to move indoors due to the wide variety of benefits that that could bring on slatted floors tied to a digester, and then leveraging a solar project and the income generated from that to essentially modernize that feedlot system. So that's one project that we are working on. But again, I have not done anything over a feedlot, but it makes good sense to me that we do it. But I've not dug enough into the dust issue in order to answer that in a way that would be beneficial.
All right. Think we're going to wrap up our time here. I know there's still a few questions and you might have those coming in, but I will throw my contact info in the chat and you can reach out specifically if there's some burning last questions. I did send out the evaluation poll, but for our speakers, please share any last thoughts. I'm going to share my screen with the workshops that Dale and Will had mentioned. And the floor is yours, our wonderful guests, for your last
Thank you,
closing
Sabrina.
thoughts.
Thank you. If you'll just click to that next slide, we'll just, I know we're trying to to end things. So yeah, these are the dates that I spoke of earlier, May 27th through the 29th. That's our upcoming one. And we have another one in the late summer, early fall. So yeah, visit the website to learn more, and I will put my email in the chat in case you want to reach out. So thanks for having us tonight, Sabrina.
Yes, thank you. And closing thoughts, Will, Josh, and Brad?
Josh, I just want to say I think you did a great job. That was some really well presented material, and I congratulate you on that. It was great.
I really appreciate it. Did you want to close out or do you want me to go first? Will.
That was my closeout.
Okay. um, I think the thing I would like to state is that as we see energy demand isn't going to drop. And as you see growth, I know we may not end up seeing as many data centers as they project being built, energy, but we're becoming electrified. It's not just data centers. That is going to push more and more of this into small agricultural communities. Finding solutions where we can meet those communities where they're at is not just logical. I think it's going to preserve solar as an industry, to be very honest, because you look at what's happened in the loss of all of our tax incentives. I fundamentally, and I could be wrong, but I fundamentally believe that if we had been grazing cattle and building meaningful agricultural partnerships and alliances years ago, we would not be in this position. And that's kind of what I'd like to. There's so many, and it's not just cattle. This can have benefits to other crops through there's a variety of things we could begin looking at. And as one that developed and understand that I have to make sure that it meets, like it's got to meet engineering standards and all of these various standards. I get it. But I also fundamentally believe that the benefits ag brings to soil overall is a better move in terms of overall site ecology and site health. So I'll kind of leave it at that. And if anybody wants to reach out to me and has questions, I'm happy to chat. I will say that I will share that presentation, but I need to go fix some errors. I had a last minute issue that really messed me up, and I didn't get a final scrub through that. And I see too many typos and too many issues that I'm uncomfortable with sharing it yet. So, but I will make sure it's ready.
Wonderful. Brad, any last comments?
Don't you put in the chat? Actually, Sabrina's work was just published in our Journal of Dairy Science that talked about what you can grow underneath solar panels, kind of just hot off the press this week, that showed which grasses and legumes grow well underneath solar panels, at least up here in the upper Midwest. And here at the University of Minnesota, we're going to continue doing lots of more agrivoltaic stuff, and we're going to put in vertical bifacial solar panels and kind of test those as well. So we're marching forward, doing a lot more agrivoltaics here.
That's really interesting, Brad. I think seeing those vertical modules in a lot of your dryland, sandy soil environments could really serve as a windbreak that can be revenue producing, even tied to projects that don't have them. So really interested to hear the results and see what happens there.
Well, with that, thank you all for joining, both our speakers and our audience. I really appreciate everyone's time and being here with us tonight. And I will note that our next webinar is on May 12th at 7 p.m. and we'll be focusing on sheep, but we will be hearing from Jess and Marcus Gray from Gray's Landscaping, as well as Dana and Paul Cummings. So it should be another great webinar, and I hope you all can join again and bring your very thoughtful questions. We really appreciate it. And this webinar is being recorded and will be shared out to anyone who was not able to join live. But that is all we have for you tonight. Thanks for joining and have a good evening.